Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third webinar in the series Modern Slavery, Changing the Conversation. This series is about modern slavery in Sussex. Our topic today is how should we support victims of modern slavery and what are the implications if we don't? Welcome to all of you. So I'm facilitator today. I'm Tony Dillon from Always Possible. Always Possible are doing this series of webinars and events for the University of Sussex. I'm going to briefly introduce the speakers. I'm not going to do a big long intro because I think it's better in their own words. So we are delighted to have with us today three people, all of whom work in this area of victim support. We have Dr. Kristi Hickle, Senior Lecturer in Social Work and Social Care at the University of Sussex School of Education and Social Work. We have Red Godfrey-Sagu, who is the CEO of the Sophie Hayes Foundation. And we have Lucy Butt, who is co-founder. We have Lucy Butt, who's co-founder and operations manager for Bramble Bakehouse. So welcome to all of you. So as I say, the format today is quite simple. We're going to have three presentations. In between presentations, there will be time to deal with your comments and questions, and we are very much hoping that you'll want to engage with the content and the speakers today. So please do introduce yourself in the chat. Hello to some people already who are joining us. Hello to Anna and Catherine from Restore at King's. King's took part in one of our earlier webinars, so it's great to have you back. So first up, I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Kristi Hickle.
This is a part of my area of interest in research and also my experience in working with survivors of trafficking in the US and more recently young people who've experienced criminal exploitation and sexual exploitation in the UK. So I've just got a couple of slides to sort of help structure my brief talk here. I wanted just to kind of start with, I guess, my thinking about how it is that we think about trafficking and modern slavery and how it's positioned with some of these other issues that they intersect with. When I sort of talk to students about trafficking and modern slavery, it feels really important to say that, we're, as practitioners in a range of settings, we're going to be interacting with trafficking victims and survivors from a number of different ways, and those issues intersect and are connected oftentimes, and they're always positioned within a wider context, a political, economic, geographic, and historical context. So, I've seen this sort of pendulum swing in interest and awareness of trafficking both in the US, which is maybe obvious where I'm from, and in the UK. Sometimes it almost feels like out of a vacuum, like, oh my goodness, trafficking is happening. It's a terrible problem. How is it happening here? How could it possibly be happening here? And any number of, and as a result, sometimes these issues are framed really in kind of black and white terms or in kind of really simplistic ways. So to be able to understand the problem that are facing trafficking victims and survivors and the many ways that we might go about helping them, we need to kind of first position their experience and our interactions with them in that wider context and all the ways that our current economic and political climates, geographies, the way that travel has changed, all of those things matter. So in thinking about and kind of speaking to this the brief around what to, working with victims or survivors of modern day slavery, I think it's really important to think about some of the ways of problematizing some of the ways that the discourse around vulnerability and agency is framed for victims. And I don't feel like I've always been on the right side of this. It's been a real learning journey for me. And working again in the States initially with adult and then child survivors of trafficking. One of the things that's been really helpful for me is this kind of concept of a continuum of limited autonomy. This comes from an anthropologist who wrote a long time ago, used this term to think about how oftentimes, we see images of, in campaigns against trafficking or people sort of chained up, right? And they're in a basement and they're very sad looking. But actually the survivors I've worked with, they don't look like that, right? They don't look anything like that. They don't look young. They're not all stunningly beautiful. They're not all white. They're not all sad looking, right? And so and they're not always in a position of being entirely without autonomy and entirely without control. They might swing back and forth, right? They might be a sex worker who comes into a situation of working for someone who's exploitative and who kind of grabs control and doesn't allow a lot of autonomy, and then they break free of that, and then they have more autonomy and they come back again, right? And so to kind of understand that that we don't, that experience of being trafficked or exploited for your labor isn't always a kind of really clearly defined kind of victimization. Then I think that we want to tackle this issue of kind of ideal victims, and this language comes from domestic abuse, and it's been used in so many other contexts. But again, oftentimes the survivors of trafficking just don't look like the people that we expect them to look like, right? When I ask students when I talk about trafficking, for a raise of hands, how many of you have seen the many films Liam Neeson did, about Taken? I think there's like a number of them. I did see the first one, I will admit. And that sometimes this way that trafficking survivors are depicted in the media doesn't allow us to think about those many ways that someone can be exploited and harmed, and really kind of their autonomy, their freedom, their labor exploited and limited. And so we need to be able to and we know from research that practitioners also are impacted by that narrative in the media, that we're looking for certain kinds of victims, right? We know we see kind of over and over again, every generation has sort of immoral panics, again, where there's a pendulum swing where we recognize that trafficking is a problem, and then we think it's everywhere. I would go to conferences back in the US probably 10 years ago, and you'd have people, starting their presentations saying, it could happen anywhere. I actually had a mother call me when I worked for a children's home for girls who were trafficked. She called me and she said, my daughter is 11, but I know when she turns 13, that's the average age of being trafficked, so I can't let her go to the mall anymore, right? And I was like, wait, you let your 11 girl go to the mall, but now that she's 13, you can't, right? That you just, so these, and that impact of moral panic for her, how could this happen, is almost devoid of that sort of the wider context this occurs in. So being able to recognize that sort of pendulum swing is important. And then finally, and this is where a lot of my research has sat and practiced for the last dozen years, is that real paradox of trauma and resilience, and that recognizing sometimes for both trafficking survivors and other people that have experienced trauma, that coping behaviors that can be really adaptive and useful for survival in the moment when a survivor is going through that experience of being trafficked and exploited, they become maladaptive in the long term, not being able to trust people, using substances. We know from research across the world that trafficking survivors are between 80 and sort of 90% experience post-traumatic stress disorder and a number of other mental health conditions. So the impact is left with them, and some of the ways that were useful for keeping them safe and protected and surviving in that dangerous situation are now less adaptive in the long run, but they were at the start a really important way of keeping them alive and safe. So I guess it comes in thinking about, sort of on the heels of thinking about, all right, vulnerability and agency, wanting to trouble our understanding of what a victim looks like and what they might need. I think this idea of even calling them trafficking victims or victims of modern slavery is worth thinking about, right? And I'm, in working with victims of other crimes, even the term victim doesn't always sit well, but for some people it feels really powerful and important, right? So it's, the label of victimhood is an interesting concept, and how people wear it and understand it and feel that it's useful for them is, I guess, a much more broader conversation. But I think it also feels particularly important in the context of trafficking in this country, because we have this sort of process of referring people to the national referral mechanism, and more recently that duty to notify, so which comes from a place, at least in my understanding, of recognizing that not everyone wants to be referred to the national referral mechanism, and there was a real gap for a while in people that didn't want to be referred. But then we had professionals, we had police officers who knew absolutely there was a case of trafficking here, and so we still needed to kind of capture and track and understand a wider picture of victimization. And so it's like, in order to receive services, we have to give someone a label. We have to kind of present them with this label. And yet what is so challenging about trafficking and any number of experiences of exploitation is that we are then framing victims and survivors' experiences in language they themselves might not understand or agree with. And that is even true for people who have English as a first language. But if you are, trying to communicate with people who don't speak English or have English as an additional language, there's this additional barrier there to kind of saying, in order to receive help, in order to give you the things that are useful, to what degree do you have to identify with the label that I'm giving you? And will you find that useful or not? And can I work with you, right? I know and work with young people who are being criminally exploited, for example. We have to find other ways of engaging with them, because you're not going to sit with a teenager who's being trafficked via county lines and say, well, you're being criminally exploited. And then have them go, well, thank you. Now I know what's happening to me. I'm really, that's great, right? That's super helpful. That's generally not how the conversation goes. It doesn't mean that we don't get there eventually, but it's a challenging starting place, right? That we're saying that you have this experience, and it's called trafficking, it's called modern slavery, but at no point maybe have you thought about your experience in that way. And so sometimes, again, it can be so useful to give someone language and a framework for their experience, so they can go, okay, that's what happened to me, that's what it was, all right. But for other people, I think it's important for us to reflect on, particularly people providing services, the impact of telling a person who's experienced oppression and subjugation and abuse, that you know better about their experiences than they do, right? Do we have to start from that point? Do we have to, right? I remember I used to talk to professionals about, can we call this young person's boyfriend their trafficker or their pimp in the US? And like, what if you do, if that's the place you start, well, how far are you going to get with that young person, right? And so how else might we begin that conversation? So just, maybe this is the sort of academic in me, but I would love to be able just to sit around and just kind of trouble and talk about the benefits and challenges of some of the labels that we have to give people in this process. Next slide. So some ways forward. Again, this is a relatively brief conversation. We're thinking about, what do we know from the research that we can take, right by now, there's actually quite a rich body of research on the ways that are effective for working with trafficking survivors. And I think you'll hear some really practical examples of that in my fellow presenters in the 2/3 of the presentation, the webinar following me. But the first thing is, I think, and again, recognizing that many of you introducing yourself are from practice, but there are probably some of those who aren't in direct practice roles, that we want to think about sort of thick rather than thin descriptions or narratives of trafficking, that people aren't just one thing. You're not just an illegal migrant or a trafficking victim, right? You're not just being smuggled or being trafficked. You are not a vulnerable woman or a woman breaking the law, perhaps. That oftentimes this isn't just a child protection issue or an immigration issue. That we want to have sort of thick understandings and narratives that are deep and rich about people's experiences, rather than saying it's this or this, right? And kind of pithy, quick ways of describing someone's kind of deep life experience. We want to find ways to engage in participatory practices. If we're working with people that don't necessarily always align themselves with or understand the label we're giving them, and we know from understandings of people's experiences of trauma that they need opportunities for their voice to be heard, for them to engage in choice and decision making in order for them to feel safe relationally. So in what ways can we creatively find, within the constraints of a system that perhaps only provides 45 days of reflection, or this much money for service provision, or a range of options for employment, what can we do to really kind of come alongside survivors in an effort of sort of collaboration and mutuality to work with them, to how do we sort of bring ourselves to a place where we reduce that power differential of researcher, of practitioner, of adult, sometimes working with children, to engage in a participatory way. I also think, and this comes from a very recent project I'm working with young people who've been criminally exploited in gangs, that there is perhaps a real role of thinking about kind of critical consciousness raising. This comes from Paulo Freire's work of thinking about how it is that sometimes people who've experienced oppression don't have the language and the framework for understanding what's happened to them, and therefore are unable to advocate for themselves well. That's a very I guess sort of crude way of describing something quite complex, but I think sometimes when we have this sort of disconnect between, and this isn't always the case, absolutely, but in instances when a victim or a survivor doesn't understand or align with that label we're putting on them, right? Or they don't really call it, you know, they think, well, I did choose to come here. Well, actually 20 pounds a day is better than what I was making back home. And so it does feel like a fair labor exchange, when in the UK, it probably, you know what I mean? That's, that maybe there's that disconnect there in labeling someone's experience, that sort of, that act of critical consciousness raising, of giving them a new framework to think about their experiences, helping them to understand what they deserve and their rights as a human, you know, and raising their consciousness is a kind of useful way, rather than saying, well, in order to get services, you have to call yourself this and fit into this plan. That we really embrace sometimes people's resistance as an under-recognized aspect of resilience and strength, that sometimes resisting services or resisting other people's ideas for their future comes from a place of strength and survival, and it's a part of their own post-traumatic growth journey. And finally, that all of those things fit within a kind of framework for engaging in trauma-informed practices, where we are prioritizing someone's physical but also emotional, relational safety. We are using that to develop trustworthy and transparent relationships. We're looking for opportunities of peer support. I think that's probably something that my you know, colleagues who are presenting after me will talk a little bit about. That we are looking for collaboration and mutuality, for the opportunity for voice and choice, and that we are, again, positioning people's experiences in their cultural, historical, and gendered context. All right, so the last slide is just a couple of examples. And again, I think, you know, this is going to look different depending on your role and what you might be doing to work with survivors of trafficking. But I think just some examples of what this could look like is, I think first, there's some sort of advocacy that we kind of collectively can do on behalf of survivors. That, you know, advocating for service provision beyond that 45-day reflection period is really key. When we understand trauma and we understand that it takes a long time to feel safe, even after you've been pulled out of a dangerous situation, you know, 45 days just isn't enough. 90 days probably isn't enough. How can we create a system where there's just more flexibility? That we really embrace that complexity, and we allow victims, survivors, as I label them here, to self-define their experience and engage in collaborative decision makings, whilst of course recognizing the need to comply. Obviously, this isn't all your direct role, but with the kind of processes that help us to recognize and provide support for survivors of trafficking. So we have to kind of just sit within and kind of dig into the complexity of having to maybe giving someone a label in order to give them services and allow them the space they need, but also recognizing that if that label doesn't sit well with you, I can be okay with that too. Let's collaboratively define this experience and allow you to engage with me. But I think we need to appropriately resource child trafficking guardians. I think a report I read just last year talked about the kind of problems with the rollout of that process. And concerningly, when I read the report, and I specifically looked for examples of talk for trauma, I recognized a lot of reference to going missing and the problem of going missing for children, and not necessarily on any emphasis on physical, emotional, relational safety. So if we're just wanting to keep kids from going missing, but we're not really understanding why it is that they're doing that in the context of trafficking, we're going to miss a trick. So we need to think a little bit more deeply and interestingly about how it is that we measure the success of a program like that. So yeah, I guess maybe that's about it. I've got references there for you. I do, because most of my work is around trauma-informed practice with both, you know, in the context of trafficking, but other experiences of trauma. I put there a kind of Padlet resource that's like a repository for resources in trauma-informed practice, and if you might find useful. I think that's it from me.
Kristi, thank you so much. That's an absolutely fantastic start, and don't worry, we're fine on timing. You've given us some amazing content there. So I meant to ask you before, are you okay for us to share these slides on the Possibility Club later? Mm-hmm. Super, everybody. So we'll put this on the Possibility Club, and I'll give a link later. Just before I pick up on some points from the presentation, Chris, I thought I might, because you were talking while people are introducing themselves in the chat. So I'm going to let you know where we've got people from. Mm-hmm. So we have people from adolescent services, we have people from safeguarding in the NHS, we have people working in supply chain. We did a seminar on what employers and consumers can do over recognizing modern slavery. We have people who work in mental health. We have somebody who's writing an essay on the effectiveness of the Modern Slavery Act 2015. So, you know, effectiveness is also something we we've covered. We have someone from Shiva Hotels who knows Red, so I think it's always fantastic when people in the room know each other. We have somebody from Nepal, so welcome to you, because this is, as Kristi mentioned, of course, an international subject. We also have people working in housing and homelessness, in midwifery, where you can come across people who may not immediately present as being a victim or survivor, but it's a route in. We have also people working in migrant help and support and safeguarding once again. And we're also delighted to be joined by Dr. Shahzad Fuladvand, who was one of the speakers on our first seminar and who's also from the University of Sussex. So yes, we have a fantastic range of people. So people, now you've introduced yourself, do feel free, as Annie said, to sort of ask questions in the chat, and we'll come back to it later. But just before we do that, Kristi, I'd like to pick up on this issue of labels, because it's always very, very difficult, even when I'm writing a short introduction, that word victim slightly clanged when I was writing it. So victim or survivor, it's important. And also, I was wondering whether, when we think that many people who are going through these traumatic experiences are in a very isolated space, and it is only their own internal resources that can help them to get through the day-to-day. You can see that people will do that by actually a process of othering. So they will say, this is happening to somebody else, I switch off. Yeah. So I'm wondering whether that might be why they are then resistant to the victim label, because they've done this othering.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's possible. I think that dissociation, right, which is the kind of clinical language we use for this, that experience of feeling like we're distancing ourselves. People just described to me over the years that it's like going around with a fishbowl over your head, or like a motorcycle helmet. Sometimes people will describe like watching their body. I did a training with police officers recently, and they described a police officer who was shot. He felt like he was standing across the street watching himself, and it's this amazing adaptive survival instinct that we as humans have. It's like, it's part of how we didn't die. We didn't all die out as a species when we were getting attacked by saber-toothed tigers, right? We have this kind of instinct to survive as humans, and dissociation is a really useful adaptive instinct, but it isn't something we just turn off, right? We don't go like, okay, I'm out of danger now, I'm going to feel whole and integrated as a whole person in my own skin again, you know? And so we don't feel whole and integrated. And so it might be absolutely that we don't really recognize that we can't look at our own experience, right? That avoidance, that inability to kind of see our experience as something that happened to us as part of it, you know. But I also think, I think that there's the media narrative around what a trafficking victim looks like doesn't always gel with people's personal experiences. I think that sometimes I work a lot more now with survivors of childhood sexual abuse. Sometimes the experience of owning a type of victimization means that we have to acknowledge our own lack of control in that environment, and that is very scary. It's like going down a rabbit hole of like, oh my gosh, I had no control. And when I don't identify with that experience, then I can push back against it. I can say I was in a bit of control, I made a choice, when actually saying, yes, this happened to me is a process of going, wow, that happened to me and I didn't have control over it, and now I feel out of control in my life. And it's just, it can be a scary thing. If someone's not in a space where they feel relationally and emotionally safe, doing that work is really complicated. So we need to be able to work with people in a flexible way, that doesn't say, well, until you tick this box and say you had this experience with this label, you can't be helped.
I mean, there can be a feeling that from the past there was a need to push people into therapy to address their issues. That seems to be a very sort of 60s or 70s approach to things. But I think from what you've been describing, it is the importance to be with the person in the reality of their experience. And the fact that it's different.
People's journeys are going to be really different, that oftentimes people have, experienced complex trauma in the context of trafficking. They're not just supposed to jump out with like 2 weeks of therapy, do you know what I mean? And go like, well, and I think, and it's not just therapy, right? That people are some whole people with economic needs, do you know what I mean? Childcare needs, in a context, there may be immigrants in a context that isn't very friendly to immigrants. There's so many things that they need from us beyond just saying, well, you had something bad happen, maybe go tell a therapist.
Excellent. Thank you, Kristi. We have a fantastic question that's coming from Tim about looking at how to identify appropriate support for people with complex PTSD. I wondered if you had some quick thoughts on that before we. I think we're probably going to come back to PTSD later, but if you had any thoughts just now.
Yes, I'm reading it now. Trauma for practitioners, sense time frame set. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think there's we have this complex PTSD is identified as a diagnosis now here in Europe, not actually quite yet in the US. But it was given its own label in part to recognize that it's different than an experience of acute trauma. It takes longer to recover from. It changes at least temporarily, the structure of your brain, the way that you see the world and yourself in it. So we just shouldn't expect people to come to a place where they can go, oh, I can, that it is important for the survival of someone with complex PTSD to see everybody as a threat. So we would expect them to see everyone as a threat for a while because that's how they've stayed safe up until now. So, Tim, I'm happy to have another conversation with you. I'm a part of kind of advising training on trauma-informed practice in Brighton and Hove. I lead a module on it at the university that I know quite a lot of social workers and police take, and I'm on something else for Brighton and Hove. So maybe we may have some sort of paths crossing in other ways, but do contact me to have that chat if you're interested.
Super. Thank you, Kristi, and thank you, Tim. It's great to get these links going because this is what it is all about. So Kristi mentioned in her presentation that the structure today is moving towards also what some of the organisations that work in survivor and victim support are doing. Next up, we have got Red Godfrey-Tsegu from the Sophie Hayes Foundation. So Red, if you're happy to start, I'll hand over to you and we'll do the slides as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the time, and absolutely agreed with some of the comments that Dr. Kristi had made around the fact that for whether you want to use the word victim or survivor, lives are not linear. They are so not linear. And at Sophie Hayes, what I wanted to do was actually start at the other end of the journey, which is for any victim or survivor, at what point do they become functioning members of society? So what is the exit strategy that they are no longer a victim or a survivor? And for us, that's the important question. And the reason why this question is really important is that Sophie Hayes was founded by a young British girl that was trafficked to Italy. And this wasn't in the 70s or the 60s, this was literally in the 2000s. We are technically 10 years old this year. And the whole point of her journey and her story was that she was taken overseas and sold into sexual exploitation. And when she managed to get back by a series of events, she realized that the UK was really not aware that modern slavery existed in the UK, because it seemed to happen to those people in those countries in faraway places, but not in the UK. And this was before the Modern Slavery Act as well. So she was actually kind of right at the front end of what does support look like. And ultimately for Sophie, the things that were really important were, yes, your past is very much a part of your life, but it does not define your future. It cannot define your future. You have to be able to mold your futures so that you can actually live rather than just exist. And the challenge we have is most victims, survivors are existing. They are purely existing. And for us, the things that's really important for us is that as the only charity in the UK solely focused on employability for women survivors, we're at the very last stop of that immediate support. The first bus stop, as I keep referring to it, is rescue and escaping. And then you end up in short-term support. Somebody's just said that I'm a little bit low, so let me just push my, let me just put my volume up a little bit. So for us, really what we've identified is that for anybody that escapes or is rescued, they have very, very immediate needs that none of us can comprehend, but they are needs that have to be supported through specialists. The second stage then becomes that, what I call that immediate to mid to long-term support. And in that space, you have everything from, is the person, do they have a roof over their head? Are they safe? Are they secure? The thing that I've identified in the work that we do, and especially working with folks in the NRM and everything, is that there isn't such a concrete plan on how you exit long-term support. What does that exit point look like? And is it consistent across the UK? It's very much dependent on where you are, what services you're provided. And for Sophie, her position was there has to be a point at which you exit being a victim and survivor. You've got to move on and become Sophie Hayes the person. So for us, over the last few years, in the 2.5 years that I've been on board, we have, quite frankly, we've kind of turned everything on its head. We constantly sit in partnership meetings and say, we have no need to work within the NRM. We have no need to do casework. We have no need to do the legal support that's needed, because there are excellent organizations out there doing that. We don't need to add into that. But there is nobody focused on the, what do you do when you want to be independent? And when does independence start? And for us, what we've recognized is that for women especially, independence really does come from employability. To be sustainably free for women, they have to be independent, and to be independent, they have to be employable. So having just set the narrative, I do want to just add into this that Sophie herself, I've never met her. She has nothing to do with our charity. She is actually living the mission of the organization. Her life has moved on. And she is an example of why this is critical work. As much as you want to focus on helping people escape and get rescued, we have survivors that have actually said to us, if I was going to know that I was going to wait 2 years to find out whether I had any legal status, therefore I'm still being kept captive, I don't know why somebody tried to rescue me. I don't know why I escaped, because this is as bad as being kept. So that, I think, is a little bit of a setting of the scene of exactly what we do in the space that we do. The expression that we use consistently is that the past has a place in your life, but it does not define your future, to the limit for your future. And we really are an organization that focuses on one program, and it's employability. It's not employment. We don't find folks jobs. We actually help women survivors understand that A, they have value, and that's value outside of being paid a slave wage or being kept hostage. B, that they have a right to say yes or no to their futures as far as employability is concerned. And then over a 12-month period, we will literally take women from a position on the first day of, nobody is ever going to want to hire me. I would never make it to education. I've never got past grade school, to at the end of the program, graduating, where they have a CV and they've actually had a placement. And Shiva, I'm glad Ruth's on this. Shiva is a classic partner for us, one of our best partners, where through a placement process, they end up with a CV, and on the CV is a recommendation from a placement provider that validates each of the women, A, has a place in society, B, has a sense of worth and a sense of value, and that the survivor themselves is driving their own destiny. So we are literally just focused on independence through employability. And what I'm going to do is not talk so much about the program, because it's fairly straightforward. We start with soft skills, resilience, confidence building, and then we transition into those skills around, if you were going to try and get into college, or if you were trying to think of a career that you wanted to do, how would you go about it? If the only thing some of our women know is WhatsApp speak, they actually don't know anything beyond WhatsApp speak. So there is a much bigger, complicated process involved in this. But I think what's more important for this discussion today is to share with you the women that we work with, and to really highlight the fact that it is the whole world that we're trying to support, from different cultures and different backgrounds. So if we could just go to the next slide. in the last few years, we've actually had 475 survivors that we've worked with. And I don't need to share the national and the global statistics, because we all know it's globally, it's the entire population of Canada plus that is currently enslaved. If you think of it that way, that makes more sense. I'm from California. It's actually more than the entire population of California that's currently enslaved. But for us, what we found as we really started to mine the data was that, yes, it's the traditional, the top three kind of nations, with Ghana as one of the largest populations that we work with. But the shocking facts for us were our eldest survivor is 67. So this is not an 18-year-old, she's 67. We've just launched a new cohort, and we had a 62 and a 63-year-old that's just applied. So everything that we know about modern slavery and with women is not based on 18 and sexual exploitation. It is much, much bigger than that. If we could just, just as a little bit of a nudge, we haven't up until recently had any UK nationals referred to our program. And that's primarily being because if you are a UK national, you do have access to local support. You do actually have that local support. Up until recently, 99.9% of our women were bought and brought to the UK. But in the last year and 18 months or so, we've started to get referrals from other organizations that deal with violence against women and girls. And what's happening is, in those spaces, women are being, especially from the Asian subcontinent, are being picked up of actually being in forced marriages. So we're getting the referrals that way, and we're now slowly starting to see referrals coming into us from the Asian subcontinent through partnerships that are not traditionally modern slavery. The other interesting thing for us is, in the Nigerian women, it was literally a 50-50 of both sexual exploitation and domestic servitude. Straightforward, double kind of exploitation there. And then Albania, it literally was kind of 80 to 90% sexual exploitation. But these are, we are capturing this data now because we are really forcing the Dame Sarah, the Anti-Slavery Commission, and the government to understand better what it is to be a victim in the UK. If we go over to the next slide. So what does 475 women actually look like? When you peel back the data itself, within a faith perspective, these pieces of data are beyond critical for us, because when I first arrived, my first question was, if we don't understand the culture, the religions, and the backgrounds and the education levels that our women come from, we have no hope of working with them to help them get through barriers. Within the women that we've got, that 55% are Christian, 26% are Muslim. It's important to know that, because there are cultural impacts within that. And then the other thing was the sexual orientation. The fact is, this statistic is not being captured enough in the modern slavery sector, considering how big an issue integrating, anybody when you are slightly different, and I use the word different to cover everything from being a brown female to somebody of the LGBTQ. If we don't capture this, we are literally making a huge challenge for ourselves and potentially putting the women at risk further down the line. The other thing that is really important to pick up is on the dependent children. The number of women that we've actually now started to observe have dependent children is getting bigger. The other statistic that is now starting to increase is the number of our survivors, our victims, that are actually becoming pregnant while they're actually on our program. So this goes back to the non-linear approach to everything. The mental health piece, I know Dr. Kristi is aware of this. The fact is that there is a significantly higher proportion of individuals that suffer from a form of mental health. What we don't do is we don't go into the depths of, what kinds of trauma and all of that. But this information is beyond critical for us to understand If we're talking to a woman who's 67, is from Nigeria, has been exploited and kept captive for 40 years, she has not passed grade school. To talk to her about employment and employability and education is a very, very unique conversation. So that's what I call the DNA part of the women that we've had through the programs. This is not all of the women. This is a sample that we've put together. So if we go to the next slide, the education one for me is the one that genuinely I struggle with the most. I came from it's no secret, I'm a first generation Indian to this country. I grew up in a very strict culture. I was not allowed to go to university. I'd never been to university. But somehow I managed to become a disaster services director and do, hurricanes and tornadoes in America. And I'm now working at Sophie Hayes. So having a university education is not always necessarily the thing that you have to do, but it also carries with it a huge amount of barriers if you're not getting a university degree. The thing about the education for us, which we've really peeled back using an awful lot of data from UN Women as well, is of the countries that we are now working with, 70% of our women come from nations where access to education and access to work is either denied or restricted. So that 70% of our women are struggling in their home as they grew up to actually even access both of those things. So when they get to the UK and we talk about employability, it is like speaking, it's like a new language. They cannot understand it. More so from a cultural perspective, because being an independent woman within the cultures is actually prohibited. It's not part of your DNA. It's not part of your language. So for us, we've really started to hone down on trying to get the information of the backgrounds that the women come from. And this is a piece of work that I'm pushing with some other partnerships as well, because this is not captured in the NRM. So the NRM does not capture this. And if most of you will have seen the Rights Lab report that was done with the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, and we were part of that, one of the recommendations was this information needs to be captured. It needs to be in the NRM, because you can't plan somebody's exit unless you know what their background is. And that's not just their ethnicity. But no surprise here. The majority of women, when asked what their education levels, couldn't answer the question, because there was there was a nervousness of not wanting to share. And that feeds into a sense of inferiority and insecurity, because they don't want to share that they actually didn't pass grade school. And then there was this whole question of converting education across to the UK. We use NARIC quite a lot for this. But overall, the two things that we were really surprised with, we actually have, it's not a huge number, but we do have women that have masters, have degrees, have diplomas. And it just feeds into the narrative of, modern slavery is literally classless, religionless, cultureless. It is applicable to everybody. Sophie herself, educated white British girl from the north, went to Italy, was trafficked. So the education piece for us is really, really important. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to run through it quite quickly. The thing that we've identified, and this has become it's almost like it's our cry, it's our 5-stage cry that we've really started to hone down and challenge, anybody that we can, to be successful in work and to be ready for education. What we found is 75% of the women do come from countries where the education and the employment was restricted or denied. This has resulted in the women not having completed grade schools. And the other side of that conversation becomes when we start talking to women in this space and say, what could you potentially consider doing? 99% of them will default to domestic roles. And they don't think of anything other than caring for children, caring for adults, and kind of cooking and cleaning. That's where they sit, because culturally, for a large portion of them, that was the expectation. Despite their exploitation, that's the expectation of society on them. The linear piece we've talked about, it is not linear. from everything from health, parental responsibilities to financial and legal aid. And all of these things will and do derail a 12-month program with us consistently. They will get moved safe houses. They will find that they're suddenly no longer available to even be able to volunteer. If as you know, you can't even volunteer despite work. The criminality piece, I think, is something that can be addressed quite quickly if there's a will. And that's the fact that we have women that have actually been arrested for their sexual exploitation while they were being trafficked. So you end up with, we have a young lady who was trafficked to the UK at 14, kept in a brothel for 7 years. When at the other end of this, when she didn't, just as she was escaping, she was arrested. She has a criminal record. She actually has a criminal record, even though she was a victim. This does have impact on future choices, and also the longer road it takes to finding education, to finding employment. It actually can be easily addressed because there are very similar programs in prison reform. So in the prison sector, as prisoners leave and actually finish their sentences and move into society, there are programs to get round the criminal record process. We just need to work closer with that cohort of specialists so that it feeds into the modern slavery sector. The inequities, this is something that I think is starting to become more prevalent, in that accessing education, whether it's college or university or even local programs, as well as employment, is a bit of a crapshoot. It depends on which borough you're in, which city you're in, which region you're in, and you could get the same course, the same person getting 2 or 3 different pieces of advice, where in one borough the person will get charged to do a course on hairdressing. In the other borough, they will not get charged anything. So the lack of consistency in knowledge that is filtered through from legislation to policy to actual delivery and implementation at ground level is incredibly unequal. And then the last piece, which is the piece that we hold, for us, which is our link to sustainable freedom, the business readiness to hire is not where it should be. At the moment, I think for businesses, it is primarily a focus on supply chains and having a modern slavery statement. Our pushback is, if you have a modern slavery statement, where is your commitment to hire victims? So where do you take that step next and actually hire victims? The challenge there, and as I mentioned, I'm glad Ruth is on this, the challenge there is most businesses don't understand to hire a victim is not the same as hiring somebody that's had as much of a normal life that we would imagine. It is a complicated, difficult process, but it's made more complicated by a business approach trying to fit everybody within a square box. And it doesn't have to be that way. The mix of things around not having a resume, the majority of our women have never, ever had a resume. They genuinely do not understand that it's important. The fact that within HR, folks need to understand it's not, if somebody has a massive gap on their past, there is a reason why there's a massive gap. So the business readiness to hire is also part of the conversation around how do victims become functioning members of society locally. So I think, having said all of that, I think I'm on the last, I think that was my last slide, and I just wanted to verbally, I wanted to just verbally wrap up with a very quick example of what we do. We take women that are referred. We don't take self-referrals because we work with partners to make sure all of the other needs are met. We then work with businesses, education, and we work with our survivors for a year to ensure that each woman has the opportunity to create the golden ticket. I refer to CVs with a reference on them as a golden ticket, because the woman to have got to that point has learned the basics of self-confidence, has built resilience, has felt that she has a worth in life, and then she's moving into a space where if she ends up being deported, if she elects to go back home or to move to any other country in the world, she has the tools to understand how to be employable wherever she's going to live. That's the goal. It's not employment. It's a, how do I find a job? How do I get into education? Because I actually have value, and this is my right. It's my human right to be independent through employability. And to finish off, I'm going to give you an example of the young lady that I've just shared who has a criminal record. She literally managed to secure a job. In between accepting the job, they changed her location. They moved the location of her workplace by 30 miles and still expected her to accept the job, because the expectation was, well, you're a victim, and you know, it was almost like it's you know, we're giving you a start. She turned the job down because she realized that commuting for 30 miles there and back every day was not good for her, was not good for her mental health. And she's about to start university. So in September, she'll start university. The important thing about this to share with you is 2 years ago, she would never have said no to the job. She'd have taken it. She'd have taken the job, and she would have literally become, you would have visibly seen the deterioration in her. But after 2 years, she felt that she owned her life and had the ability to say, no, this is not the job for me. So that's what we do. We are literally talking about that last bus stop before a victim or a survivor becomes a member of society and stays a member of society and doesn't end up back as a victim that's been re-trafficked.
Red, thank you so much. Incredibly powerful stuff there. I'd like to put a couple of questions to you, but just before I do that, just to say thank you for amazing information in your presentation, and also for the stories of the people that you work with, those 475 people, and that fact that really surprised me to know that across the world it's a population greater than Canada that is still enslaved. It's just such powerful stuff. So I'm just sort of making sure the panel all happy. So Lucy, just to let you know, I think we'll probably come to you just a shade after 1 o'clock, if that's okay. And just now, if Red, if I could ask you a couple of questions. One is to do with language. I'll read them from the chat. It might be a bit easier than you having to do it yourself. So Daisy asks whether it's part of your program to teach English, and I think sort of building on that, does the inability to speak in English affect people's ability to access services?
So the answer to that is our requirements to be in the program are that they have to have basic comprehension English, base level reading and writing. So they have to have that. It is impossible to build this program if you were working through translators, because you just can't. The women themselves have to own their voices to be able to move forward, and to do it through a translator. We had a very small trial at this and it didn't work. So for us, they are all referred. They're all a minimum of 18. They do not have to be in the NRM. Initially, we had a 50-50 split. 50% were NRM, 50% weren't. We are now finding that we are getting more and more and more coming through the NRM itself, which sometimes actually is a bigger challenge, because they can't work, they can't volunteer, they get sucked into the current immigration policy arguments, which are just across everything. But there's the one thing that I can say consistently for them is, even if they have some baseline English, initially they suffer from a massive lack of confidence. So it's the confidence piece, because they don't get to be in a cohort of women. Our women are grouped into 10 to 15 per region. Sitting in front of your caseworker in the NRM in a language that is not your first language is really hard, because you're not yourself. You know that your life is being scrutinized. If you're in anything like that, the difference for us is that within the cohort, they all know that the woman next to them is there for the same reason, that they've had an experience or a past, and that's why they're there. And they open up, and the actual ability to communicate in a second language, we see from the beginning to the end, significantly increases.
Fantastic. So there's a requirement for a sort of work with the person over language skills so that they can find their voice, is what you said. I think that's a really good way of stating it. And if I just may read the question from Shahzad. A question for Ed. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. If I understood you correctly, the majority of individuals that you have in your program are non-UK survivors. I appreciate you mentioned the NRM process is not essential for the foundation. However, I wonder how potential victims can be provided with services, especially if they have to leave the country. For how long can they stay in your program?
Oh, okay. I was about to say something and I realized I can't share it because it's embargoed at the moment. So we've just launched a new 5-year strategy. So, but we haven't shared it yet.
Watch this space.
Yes, watch this space. There's two things here. One thing that I did totally, and my apologies, I did and completely miss out. My life in disaster services recognized very early on that the world was going digital, that, you know, if you needed to communicate with people, you needed to have digital skills. People needed to be able to be online and stuff. We were already heading towards a conversation of when does employment and employability and education start going down a digital space. COVID just fast-tracked that. So COVID came along, we converted our entire program into remote programming. And the example is normal cohort, we'd have an enrollment of about 30 or 40 women. In January, we had 120 women apply to be in the remote program. What that does is the question came up, if I get moved from this safe house from Manchester to Birmingham, do I technically still stay in the program? And the answer was yes. But if they had physically moved to a location that we didn't have an office, we couldn't support them. So for us to build a digital program has just meant that a remote program, it's meant that we're aiming towards saying any woman anywhere in the UK has the ability to be on our program remotely. And we do all of that, we provide all of that. And then the question ironically did come up on what happens if I'm deported. And we've actually got a couple of these cases going on where there is a chance that both of the women that I'm thinking of will more than likely end up leaving the country. And there are some legal concerns about delivering programs to people not currently in the UK that we're trying to figure our way through. But watch this space.
So watch this space, and Red, thank you so much. And again, we'll share your slides if we may. And I have a feeling that people are very much going to want to keep in touch with your organisation and find out what that next step looks like. So thank you, and also thank you to Shahzad for that question. So now, if we could move over for our third presentation to Lucy, please, at Bramble Bakehouse. Thank you.
I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully everyone can, maybe some presenters can nod if you can see that. Great. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm really pleased that we're doing this important work in East Sussex, because sometimes I feel like we're missed off the grid in Sussex a little bit. There's a lot of work going on London and sort of north of the UK, but not a lot going downhill, although the need is still obviously very great. I'm Lucy. I'm one of the co-founders of Bramble Bakehouse. We've been supporting female survivors for several years. We provide therapeutic baking workshops alongside employment and education support, and we are primarily working across the southeast at the moment, covering any woman that's from as far as Southampton, North London, across to Kent. So we've got quite a wide region to cover. We have just begun a new programme a couple of weeks ago. Obviously, COVID made that quite difficult for us to meet in person. And we've got 8 survivors with us at the moment. The long-term plan for us is that we want to see survivors placed into work at our bakery. So the idea is that you're coming to get your coffee and cake, but it's not just coffee and cake. Actually, every penny that's made is being pumped into the future of these women that we're supporting, and they'll receive employment through that as well. So I'm kind of touching on actually some things. This is the problem with going last, is actually you're covering a lot of material that has already been very well covered already. But I just kind of wanted to highlight actually the importance of understanding where survivors are at the point that they're coming to us. In our experience, we would split this into 3 different areas. So you've got your physical sort of issues that you're dealing with, your aches and pains, your trouble sleeping, your mental health, which is obviously a massive thing, and Red, you touched on this as well in your presentation really helpfully, and the practical things, access to education. Some of them, or most of them, are unable to work in the UK. In our experience, we're seeing that women that come to us are actually experiencing all 3 of these things. There are this is just a little bit of interesting data that I found from a report that was done by Stolen Smiles. They looked at women who were being, or actually generally survivors that were being rescued, and identified that actually they're dealing with a lot of issues even after 3 months. So that 45-day period definitely is not enough, and we know that now, and that conversation is happening, but actually they're still dealing with a lot of problems that need support and need help with. So thankfully there are a number of support services that are already aiding survivors, and we've obviously heard from Red today with the Safe Case Foundation. We've got counsellors, we've got accommodation providers and safe houses, and actually the important thing is that they're all working together in collaboration with each other to provide the support that is needed. We would probably say that we fit into the education employability side of support, with elements of wellbeing. We've just developed a new programme at the moment, and we're very much focusing on wellbeing and empowerment and confidence, self-confidence, that kind of thing, because we're seeing that those fundamental things are really important for building a future. 80 to 90% of survivors that come through the programme Bramble Bakehouse do not have the right to work in the UK, but it's absolutely clear that they need transferable skills which can help them in a variety of different settings. So really we try and meet survivors exactly where they are, and that means giving them the skills that they need to move forward, and similarly to the Safe Case Foundation, those building blocks that are going to help them move forward from that victim stage to actually survivor to independence as well. So the question was posed in this webinar actually about what the implications are that if we don't help, but I wanted to kind of flip this on its head a little bit and ask, what are the benefits if we do? So in 2019, the British Red Cross provided 2-year support for survivors, and they were measuring the impact, the positive impact that had on them as a whole. And you can see from yourself from some of these statistics that the benefits were huge, like the freedom from abuse and neglect, the empowered attitudes that they had, the engagement they had in school and training and work, because they were given those opportunities to do so. And that's really what we focus on, is helping them to get those opportunities to move forward. So we are seeing amazing things at Bramble. Like I said, we've been running for several years. The top quote that I've included is something that an email we received actually just last week after 1 week of coming on the programme, and you can really see what an impact support is having on survivors. The second quote is actually from a survivor on our previous cohort, and this is a great story to share actually, of complete transformation. This is somebody that came to us with years of sexual exploitation, and they didn't feel, they kind of felt like they were ready to give up. It's a story that she shared with us of wanting to take her own life at that stage. She's now gone on to study at university, and that's as a result of people empowering her and giving her the skills that she needs to say, yeah, my past is part of my past, but like Red said, it doesn't define my future, so I can move ahead and I can improve my life and move forward with that. So there's 2 things I kind of want to use, and I'm glad I am going last actually, because maybe this is a bit of a wrap up of what we've all talked about, but in our experience, these are the 2 things that are really, really fundamental to what we're doing. As an organisation, we believe that, yeah, everybody should be working on these and to see sort of transformation happening. So the first one is collaboration. So I can't actually stress enough how important this is. And actually, you know, forums like this are amazing because we are collaborating so well together. There's so many learnings that we can take from each other, and so many insights that we can be sharing across the whole of the UK. And I'm not just talking about charities working with charities, I'm talking about charities working with businesses. And for us, we're working with Waitrose at the moment, and their sort of social impact and how they can be helping individuals and survivors. So yeah, just sort of to encourage everyone that collaboration is what we've seen is the key. The second is community. Creating a community for survivors to meet together has been the absolute core of what we're doing. Being able for them to be able to sit down with like-minded individuals and say, yeah, you've experienced something that's very similar to what I have, and be able to communicate and engage together in that way is absolutely at the core. And I think, you know, if anything, anyone is starting to think about how to support survivors or is supporting survivors so far, I'd say actually that's one of the fundamentals there. Yeah, I think if we kind of focus on those two things in my personal experience working at Bramble, then we can help survivors to move forward with their futures.
Lucy, thank you so much, and excellent to focus on collaboration and community. I'm going to give a quick plug for your organisation. I watched the video on your website about how you created Bramble Bakehouse, and I think it's such a powerful story. So I just wondered whether you wanted to mention a little bit about what it was that called you to do this kind of work.
Yeah, I mean, I know not everyone will relate to this. I'm a Christian, and my faith is very important to me. And I think that was one of the core things that kind of brought together what I wanted to do. I'm very passionate advocate for women and women's rights and making sure they have equal opportunities. And I love baking. So it was kind of the perfect combination really to do something. I'm very much believe that social enterprise is the way forward. And yeah, which is kind of why we want to open the cafe, which is very much so focused on that social impact that we're achieving there.
Oh, and we've got a very important question here as well. So where are you based? I think we're going to get some people through the door.
Yeah, we're based in East Sussex. We're currently running workshops out of Brighton. We've just moved across to Brighton, which has opened a whole arena for us really, that we never had access to before. But like I said, we cover the whole of the southeast, so we do get a number of referrals, mainly through the NRM. Most of them are coming through that, but we have had a few that aren't from the NRM. And similarly to the Sophie Hayes Foundation, we don't take self-referrals. It's all through a caseworker or a support worker that's working alongside them. But we don't have a physical premises for our bakery yet. So if anybody would like to support us in that way, that's kind of our next plan for the next 18 months, is working on the business side of things and how to provide that employment opportunities for survivors.
I think there will be quite a lot of people that will want to help with that. I think that's an excellent idea. I think, you know, straight away everyone's perked up to, yeah, we would like to come over and see what you're doing. So in terms of the work that you're actually doing with your program with these women, you have this experience of actually seeing them at the beginning of the process and at the end. And I'm just wondering whether you could tell us a bit more about what the change is in.
Yeah, I mean, if I specifically think about this cohort, I guess that's the most relevant for us at the moment. And this has been an interesting cohort. I mean, like anyone, you're always learning, right? But those that are coming to us, some of them have only been rescued for a year. Some of them have been out of their situation of trafficking for several years. I'm really seeing the impact that it's having for those that are very new, for use of a better word, compared to those who have potentially had 3 years of kind of working towards independence. But I think actually what it's made me realise is that the great thing is they're all learning from each other, and the confidence that perhaps someone who's exited for 3 years compared to someone who's exited for 7 months, that community aspect is where it comes in. They're helping each other, they're supporting each other. And yeah, it is, you know, after 18 months of not doing a program, you kind of forget what it's like, and you see these women that are coming in and you know, they don't have any confidence, they don't have any belief in the future of what they're doing, and you really get a chance to feed into that and to provide that support and that that care and that compassion actually, that's so important to make them realize that I can do more than what's happened to me in the past. And a big part of that is through our baking workshops. So it's therapeutic, but also it's a creative outlet for them to be able to say, oh, I can follow this recipe and make this delicious thing and put my creative spin on it and take it home to my safe house and then, you know, make it for all the women that are in the safe house, which is exactly what they're doing. So yeah, I think the impact is huge, and seeing them kind of come out the other side and apply for university courses or go into voluntary work or to work is amazing, really amazing.
Oh, thank you. And that is a wonderful story to hear from the people actually doing this. We have a question which I'll just read you from the chat from Tim. If we wanted to refer someone in, how would we do this?
You can do that. I'll drop an email actually, in an email address in the chat, but we use sort of a dedicated email address, referrals@bramblebakehouse.co.uk. We in the past we've run one workshop a year. We're really wanting to up that sort of three to 5 workshops within the next year or so, because we're just getting a huge demand for the service and we need to do more of it. So that would be the easiest way, is to say we have women that want to come on the course, and we'll let you know when the next courses are available.
Super, excellent. I think we possibly have another question coming. Oh yes, also, can anyone volunteer or women only?
Yeah, this is a tricky one actually. I think it depends what you're doing. On our programs, we specifically have female volunteers, and that's because we want to ensure that the women that we're working with are safe and they feel comfortable. But we do have male trustees. We've got, you know, an amazing board of people that are committed to Bramble Bakehouse, and we've also got a number of people who are helping with other skills, so be it marketing, fundraising, that kind of thing. There are ways to get involved, but primarily working on the programs, it's female only, I'm afraid.
Absolutely. I think we understand the need to create a safe space, but also the fact that there's lots of opportunities for guys to get involved and support you in other ways. Thank you. That's been excellent, and I'm thinking we've got about a quarter of an hour left, and I think we've had the 3 presentations which have all followed on beautifully from each other, and I just wondered at this point, and someone saying I really want cake, have to say I didn't have breakfast this morning and I'm really thinking about cake now. But before we start thinking about cake too much, I just wonder whether I could bring in the other panelists to comment on what they've heard from the other speakers, and maybe if we go to Kristi first, please.
Yeah, I think I was, having not had a lot of experience of contact with either organization, really encouraged to hear the emphasis on kind of choice and control and sort of strengths-based working. I think, and also some of those practical skills, you know, in the US, I saw oftentimes women involved in sex work, and they were, you know, criminalized for some of, you know, what had happened to them, more so than they might be here. But they would oftentimes kind of say, well, yeah, I'll get out of this situation when you give me an opportunity to make legitimate money, you know, to take care of my kids. I got to have a place to live. What else am I supposed to do? So the emphasis on employment, on kind of empowerment, on allowing people to try on other identities and, you know, and new skills. I also think there's something about, I loved hearing Liz talk about just the kind of physicality of baking, you know, and sometimes just that need to kind of move our bodies, and that embodied experience when we've been traumatized is all really kind of wonderful work. It sounds like it's happening. So it's a pleasure to listen to you both.
Thank you. And I was thinking actually with that point of the action of bringing a group of women together to make something together, in this instance to make food together. First of all, it has, you know, deep cultural significance to nearly every society. But I'm also just wondering, Kristi, whether there's a sort of live NLP aspect to actually doing that with people.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it's yeah, just the presence of other people, kind of connection, being able to move multiple ways of feeling kind of safe and grounded with other people it's just really useful.
Absolutely, and that the fact of actually going through a process, and the fact that, as Lucy mentioned, at the end of it they can take the food away and share it with their friends. I think that's incredibly important. I'm just going to have a little look at the chat. Actually, this is quite neat. Thank you, Kristi, because we've got a question now from Tim to Red. So if I could pop over to Red, please, and I'll read you the question. Red, Tim is saying, what type of roles and organisations have you been able to place women in? Sorry, this came up a little bit earlier, but the chat was going quite quickly. So it's a question on the type of roles and organisations where you've been able to place women.
So there's a couple of things there. We don't have as many sectors as we would like. That genuinely is the truth. We have successfully placed women in retail, in the hotel, in hospitality, in education, finance, just about every sector you could think of, but not consistently. The one area that we are really starting to see a lot of interest now is the NHS. There is an awful lot of our survivors that are looking to get into the NHS. Ultimately, it's almost like the women don't believe that anybody will ever employ them. So it's very hard for them to actually say, well, I think I would like to do this. And the thing that I did forget to mention out of all of this in the community space that Lucy and Dr. Kristi have mentioned, we have always had a survivor network, which I have actually been uncomfortable even using that expression, because it was given by us to a group of people that we have no lived experience on. And it's been a stop and a start. But as of the beginning of this year, it is now a totally owned by the survivors, ran by the survivors, and they've even given themselves a new name. They call themselves the Crew, and that stands for Creative, Resilient, Empowered Women. And their responsibility, they have a fully functioning committee where the committee members now are being mentored into actually becoming leaders. So the journey of growing continues as they build their survivor network and do functions between them. But what we've found through Crew is the women in that space have started to talk about things like, you know, if I could just get the grade to do this role, I've always wanted to do this. These are conversations they didn't have with us earlier on. They had them as they've connected with their peers and their colleagues in this space. So for us, you know, there is, when you have a woman that says, I've literally been locked up for 20 years. I could never work in an office. I could never work indoors. I want to work outside. That's about as big a steer that we're getting in the beginning. And where we end up with is over a year's period, the young lady, she's still young to me, ends up working as part of a community allotment. Through the community allotment, she ends up getting a role at a local nursery. She is now working at a local nursery. So if you imagine every sector of life in the UK, there is a space there for a survivor to start their lives over again.
Excellent. And in terms of what you might be looking for in terms of possibly support, you mentioned NHS. We've got NHS people on
yes,
the call here, so please do get in touch. I volunteer in another careers support program in Sussex, and we find NHS careers tremendously supportive. Yeah. So I think, you know, there's potentially a very good link there. And I hope that, you know, we'll keep the recording and we'll keep your details, and we hope very much that colleagues will want to get in touch, because I think there's real potential there.
And Tony, just to kind of, I genuinely think events like these are really important, because it's no secret the NHS collectively has had an awful lot to deal with in the last literally 10 years and the last 18 months. The knowledge of modern slavery is not consistent across NHS workers. They have patients that walk in that are victims and are consistently victims. And what we've said over and over again is that the ability to change has to be to know first. So I'm going to be on a panel for the women ENTs in September. Why would somebody from Sophie Hayes be a keynote speaker for the women ENTs? And the reason is you are going to end up with patients in front of you that are potentially victims. And if you understand that first and accept that it's going on under our doorsteps, literally next door to us, we just want to be able to say, we're not expecting you to suddenly offer opportunities so our women suddenly become, you know, ear, nose, throat specialists, but it's an awareness. There is an awareness there that there isn't a sector of society where this is, you do not get to walk away from. This is prevalent across the UK.
That's such an important point. We have touched on this in sort of earlier seminars, and it is the really high importance of awareness raising. Yeah. And Reg, you also mentioned in your presentation, we asked this question of what happens when we don't support survivors, and you gave the example of somebody who was missed, yeah, and who ended up with a criminal conviction. Yeah. So thank you, by the way, for giving us the answer to the question. If we miss people, then, you know, they can end up with a conviction. That makes, you know, the next stage is even more difficult for them. Or also somebody else mentioned that if they're not identified properly and they're not supported properly, they can go out of slavery and they can go back into other forms of exploitation. So that you know, that's really important. I think, unfortunately, we're starting to run out of time. So thank you very much to everyone for the questions and the responses we've just had. Annie, I just wanted to spend just a minute just looking at a couple of next steps on this project before I come back to everybody for thanks. Here we go. So we've got some upcoming events. As people have mentioned, it's very important to keep this going. We very much want to do this. So our upcoming events are on the 23rd of July. We have a timed conversation, which is a facilitated chat room and forum inspired by live text conversation with a guest expert. So Tim Reed was the first person to help us with this, and I hope that Tim agrees that went very well. So we're doing another one on the 23rd. Next time, the topic is modern slavery. What next? And we have with us that day, who is in the room now with us at the moment, it will be Dr. Shahzad Fuladvan from the University of Sussex. So we're keeping a theme going and keeping engaging going. So I would be absolutely delighted if you would, all audience and speakers, if you're able to join us for that, because we're looking at this idea of what next. And I think very much I want to put it back to you. When we do these webinars, we say we are so grateful to the panelists for coming and giving their time. But I'm always wanting to say to you, how can we help? Because everybody who's been in the room of these has been saying, well, we want to know about what the next step is. So that's great. Now, I think just on the next slide, just a little thing about continuing the conversation. We have created the Anti-Modern Slavery Changing the Conversation Circle on the Possibility Club. So this is a community of people and organizations interested in discussing and debating the move towards sorry, this is when Zoom lets me down because my cameras are over the end. I think it's moving to a slavery-free world. Correct me if I'm wrong. So the link is www.thepossibilityclub.org. So there we go. So if we stop sharing the slides now, thank you very much. All that it remains for me to do is to thank our speakers, who really honestly have been the most fantastic panel. The information that you have given us, the way that you have shared the reality, the fact that you know so much about your areas and that you are actively engaged in this work, I think has been truly inspiring for everybody. So thank you for a fantastic set of presentations, which, as I say, this seminar is going to be recorded, so there'll be a recording available. Please do share all the audience members with colleagues that you think might benefit from this or want to get involved, and want to build this community. So thank you once again to all of the speakers, and thank you to the audience for listening and participating and supporting this project, which was by always possible for the University of Sussex. We've been really impressed by all of the organisations who we've managed to get on side to do this. It's been fantastic. So I'm going to leave you with thank you very much, and all the best wishes to all of you for the future work that your organisations are doing. Thank you all very much.